Advantage Partners. And we have a wonderful panel here today focused on how do we bring all of the pharma stakeholders into 2019, and in particular, given the variety, the diversity, the challenges of opposing interests, how do we help them come together and work collectively? So I'm going to let each of the panelists introduce themselves, and then we'll jump right into the conversation. Sir.
Chris Boone, Vice President of Global Medical Epidemiology and Big Data Analysis at Pfizer.
I'm Koetke. I am a biomedical engineer turned pharmaceutical consultant. I'm now working for Deloitte in France, having recently moved over from their US member firm. And I have a passion for the intersect of science and engineering meeting business.
Haider Alleg, working at Ferring and I'm also the head of digital.
Fantastic. Whoa, I'm definitely too loud. Haider could go up, I could go down. So the title of ours is Let's Take Pharma Stakeholders to 2019, How to Satisfy All the Interests. So Chris, I'm going to start with you. What does that sentence mean to you, or that phrase mean to you, particularly as you think about external stakeholders to pharma organizations?
Okay, repeat the first part of the question again.
What does the statement mean to you about bringing all of us into 2019?
Okay, right,
And meeting the interests?
Yeah, I think that the theme of one of the recurring themes of this meeting has been about engaging all the different stakeholders within the healthcare ecosystem, and the central part of that is placing the patient at the center. And so, I've enjoyed the talks that we've had this morning because many of them have focused on this idea of patient centricity. And so for us, one of the big things as we move to becoming more of a patient-centric organization, being Pfizer, engaging the other parts of the ecosystem are becoming equally important. We now have focused a lot of our efforts on engaging with patients, individual patients, as well as patient advocacy groups, but also how do we forge better relationships with providers and integrated delivery networks, how do we engage better relationships with payers, how do we engage with better relationships with the digital companies, and what does that look like in a new paradigm? I think that we're now at a time now where there is a shared incentive structure that hasn't quite existed before, whereas before it was a leverage play, but now it's how do we do the best thing for the patient. So generally we all have, which is what it really takes. I think it takes a collective shared vision, and it takes incentives as to why you would want to engage in that type of relationship.
Great. We're going to come back to this question of the new paradigm and how you're thinking about that. But before we go there, Haider, can you share with us sort of the answer to the same question, but instead of focused on the external ecosystem, on the internal ecosystem, cross-functionally within our organizations?
Yeah, I think what we have is a problem of definition sometimes. So we see things through different lenses. So the weight of a stakeholder, depending on regions or functions, is very different. And that creates also some chaos because what we want to do is creating value. And if you don't have a good definition, then you don't bring value. So you kind of hit and miss. But that's the first paradox. And the other paradox is when we talk about stakeholders, everybody agree and we sell a vision. And we don't sell actually like a solution to a problem of those stakeholders have. So that's kind of also the second paradox that I see from the internal perspective. Of course we want to be patient-centric, but that's what we want to expose to the outside. But when we listen to those stakeholders, then you come back to my first point. It's very, very complicated to map out.
Right. Patient centricity may look different to a marketer than it does to a drug developer or a bench scientist, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we've heard a lot both from the stage this morning and also from the floor about third parties. So I wonder, Katie, given that you're our third party,
Exactly.
Do you have thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because you have both perspectives of the internal and external stakeholder engagement coming from being your service provider, being your consulting firm. I think there's an important factor of integrating both your external and internal stakeholders and making sure that you're aligning all of their interests, their visions, their goals to match whatever product you're producing, product you're marketing, whatever your overall vision and goal is for product. And so I think it's really easy to get sidestepped into focusing on one subset of stakeholders versus them as a combined whole, which as your service provider, as your consultants, is something that we really strive to find the integration between both to make sure all needs are met ultimately.
Can I ask you the follow-up question, which is sort of the second part of our focus for this session, which is from that sort of looking outside in, what are the categories of interest that you think are at play across all of these stakeholders in the ecosystem?
So I'd say my focus is actually a bit more narrow, so I don't want to address a bit too far out of the work I do. So specifically, I work within a manufacturing ecosystem, and I think we, within manufacturing, have a really actually a narrow focus of stakeholders that I think is a bit problematic. We focus on stakeholders that are helped driving production cost, working with quality and R&D to improve quality, things of that nature, improve production times. But ultimately, we typically rule out a lot of the stakeholders, and most importantly, our patients that we're working with at the end of the day, and we don't necessarily encompass and integrate their needs and their interests into the manufacturing process, which I think when you involve stakeholders, especially your end users and your patients, really early on, starting with R&D, starting with drug development, you can then develop a manufacturing process that incorporates their interests, their goals, to ultimately better serve patients down the line. And so I think my focus currently is a bit narrow scope of some of the other gentlemen up here, but I think it can be expanded certainly.
And also the nuts and bolts of many of our businesses, right?
Yes.
Quality, time to market, cost. So maybe narrow, but also foundational in some ways. So from an external perspective, when you look out from Pfizer into the world, what are the categories of interest or needs, as you use the word, I think it's a great word, that those stakeholders are bringing to you or want to engage with you on? What matters to them?
Well, I think it depends on who you're talking to. I mean, I have a number of, well, I'll just go through the
Yeah, go through the circle.
When I think about patients, I think the biggest role they want to play is an increased role in the direction that they think that drug development should take, where we should focus our priorities. And for all intents and purposes, it makes a lot of sense, right? I mean, we should be better understanding what the patient experience is with our therapies and how do we better address their needs. When it comes to payers, I think it's been interesting because there's still a bit of a push and pull. What we want to do and what we want, they're at a stage now where they want better RWE or real-world evidence to support why our therapy should be covered, and so there's a value associated with it. But the challenge that we have is that honestly, no one is really defining what value really means, and that's the first part. And the second thing is that what evidence is really necessary that would be sufficient to help them make that coverage determination. And that's really been an interesting journey thus far with payers. With providers, it's interesting because they're now they're caught in the middle of what you feel is what's in the best interest of the patient, what do they need in order to what's sufficient for payers, and then also how do they ensure that they're giving the highest quality of care for the patient. So of course they want to, most providers, they want to provide the best level of care that they can. They want the best evidence available. It's hard to accept evidence for them from a manufacturer or from a pharma company. So we really have to get to a space where we're co-creating clinical evidence that would be sufficient for them to make the necessary clinical decisions. So I think what you're seeing is that the needs of each of the stakeholder groups is different, but the foundation of it all is around generating evidence that would assist us.
We'll go to the internal stakeholders in a minute, but let me just dig in on this question of the payers, because we actually haven't talked a lot about payers in the last couple of days, which makes a lot of sense because we're such a global group, so there's many different systems. But when you think about the payers, as they sort of rank their interests, what's most important to them, and there's no clear or shared definition of value, how do you think they look at quality of life versus clinical outcomes versus cost savings or cost loss with time out of job? Like, how are they thinking about, and I'm sure there's other categories I'm not thinking of, but what's most important?
You know, it's really hard to say. I think I would say cost is probably the most important thing, but certainly when they're engaging with us, it's about clinical outcomes. So I think it really just depends on the audience. And I don't want to take shots at payers, but I think generally, they're looking at the total cost of care. And we've learned that just in our conversations with them, if we're not focusing on the total cost of care, then they lock in on that specific issue of drug pricing, which becomes very distracting from the overall conversation. I mean, if you look at some of the numbers for patients in the U.S., sure, the cost of their therapies may have increased, but the cost of hospitalizations has decreased significantly, right? So the focus should be on the total cost of care and the quality of care that the patients are getting, and if we're seeing positive clinical outcomes, which I think we are.
Yeah, great. Internally speaking.
I mean, the paradigm with payers is shifting to performance-based reimbursement, value-based analysis. You have also tenders management that is getting higher. So I see from an internal perspective that we are changing into a more data-driven analysis to provide this value, which is interesting then because the more we are bringing this data-driven analysis and a response to those payers, if they are stakeholders here, it creates two things. One, we look at the world differently. Maybe we are more a prevention company than just treating and curing. So that changes also the way you look at the stakeholders map, because if you are preventing, actually using your cure, is that a role of a pharmaceutical company that you might ask, this big question. But it does have an interest for the payers, because they want to look at it from that lens. And second, once you have a data-driven model, it's much easier to map out this value internally and align forces from sales to marketing to medical affairs to basically look at providing this value for this map of stakeholders.
And we also have heard a lot over the past 2 days about talent, the war on talent, the need for talent. And I know when we talked earlier, you were very passionate about culture and the care and feeding of people. Can you say more about how you think about those interests as well and how it plays into all this ecosystem?
Yeah, I guess because it's not just a mathematical exercise. It's depending on people. And if we are looking at the world and we have a vision, so you need to make sure that your stakeholders are actually your people. So they are the best ambassadors of what we are trying to do, because if they are not aligned with what you are trying to sell in the next 15, 20 years, how do you want them to sell the solution to the stakeholders in the next 3 months? But that there is a huge alignment with internally from top to bottom, especially in this middle management sandwich, to make sure that they understand this value added for what we are trying to achieve. So that's the cultural aspect of to align it,
When this group came together to prepare, I'm going to quote the collective for a minute. One of the things that was said was, we can't expect our employees to be patient-centric if we're not employee-centric first. And I thought that was such an amazing insight to see a different version of the value chain, that we have to be treating people well in order for them in turn to do the same.
Yeah.
Katie, things to think about from the outside perspective or from the manufacturing, which is a fascinating kind of part of this whole thing that you see as interests that are important.
I think moving beyond 2019, we need to have a more specific focus on including all stakeholders and, in my opinion, most importantly, your patients and your end users immediately on at the start of the value chain. So I mentioned it briefly earlier, but involving those patients as part of the R&D and drug development process. And I think it was touched on by the patient panel yesterday, but when you involve patients and your end users early on, you're going to end up developing a drug product that's going to have their interests, their goals in mind. So it's going to be a product that patients are more inclined to take, that's going to solve their needs versus just curing an ailment.
Yeah.
I also think from a manufacturing perspective, when you do involve all these stakeholders so early on in the process, you're able to develop, again, that manufacturing process that is going to be in line with their interests and goals. And as a result, you have some of those items like increased quality, reduced waste, increased time or decreased time to market, things like that that really drive some of the overall pain points as well as successes within the pharmaceutical industry.
I remember when I was at Sanofi Genzyme, which was originally a biologics company, and patients would come into the manufacturing site and see these, back then, huge steel vats, right? Now, goodness, we're not in huge steel vats anymore, but they would come in and they would look at it and they would see all the people and they would see the quality folks on the line throwing vials like
can't use that one. And one of their takeaways often was, oh, that's why it's so expensive. It's such a hands-on business. And I think sometimes that gets lost. I don't want to get into a conversation about price, but I'm just saying, like, there is some mutual understanding that can be built when we even just share information about what it's like.
Transparent access to data, whether it's manufacturing or anywhere along the production line, is really key to enabling patients to be involved in their health journey. And when patients are involved in their health journey, they have better health outcomes. And so it's a pretty critical aspect across the line.
So the gang is going to close this session by sharing their call to action to all of you, their colleagues, around this issue of how we help our stakeholders move into today and beyond. And while they're doing that, in your back brain, please consider if you have any questions for this great group of folks. We're happy to take them as time permits. Call to action.
I have to go first.
No, call to action.
No, I'll go first. I think that, if you think about the call to action, it's what we're hearing continuously from all the different speakers at this meeting. I think that we heard the need to close the loop on the ecosystem, meaning that we need to get out of our own echo chamber and really engage with the other sectors within the industry. I think there's been a call for the need for data or information transparency to the point that Katie just made. I think there's been a call to have new or sustained leadership throughout. I mean, I've heard that throughout every single talk that we've had at this meeting. And then I also heard this notion around the workforce, which I think is interesting because when I tend to look at it slightly different. I think that we're at a point now where the world is different, and the discussion today has been around transformation. In order to effectively transform, you need to infuse a certain level of new thinking into the paradigm. And the problem that I found that we have in pharma is that we're recycling the same talent just throughout different organizations. So there is a lack of new thinking into this new paradigm. And so what I'm hoping that we do is start to think of what does that talent really mean, and where do we really identify the specific skills that we need that will take us from point A to point B and C and beyond. And that may not look like the talent that we have today, and that's okay. We're having a number of discussions within Pfizer where we're looking at the talent pool and we're saying, okay, will this talent take us to the level that we need to go to? And unfortunately, in some cases it won't, and then in some cases it will. I think that we need talent that's much more intellectually curious beyond just what they do in their day-to-day jobs. We need folks that start to think about it, that are a bit more adaptive to the level of change. Pharma, although we've seen routinely the number of layoffs, the business and operating model of the industry has not changed much at all. The layoffs and all that is more of a cost cutting or a cost reduction play and less about a transformation play. And so I hope that when we start to think about talent and new talent, that we're looking at new skill sets and we're looking at new leadership and new thinking that will take us to the next level.
If you were to characterize the new paradigm you've referenced in a sentence or two, how would you describe it?
I think that, and do I have to use one word or can I use a long?
A whole long sentence. You can hyphenate,
how much time do you
semicolons.
Well, I think that I'm looking at it, I think that, you said it, someone said it earlier today when they talked about, first of all, instead of saying digital transformation, it's about business transformation. And I think that what that means for us is moving beyond, it's not just thinking of, we're now going to be a digital company, because that to me is a capability that should be institutionalized, period. It should not be something that we need to highlight that we're a digital company. So that said, I think that we now have to think about ways that we better engage the other sectors like we've never done before. We have to think about how we become more direct to consumer. And what does that really mean? How do we build those wraparound services that will enable patients to make more informed decisions? How do we engage providers better? I can tell you right now, pharma has been mostly focused on two things, regulatory approval and coverage, right? So now we're looking at it and we're saying, how do we become more than that and think about beyond the pill services that are necessary to really create value for all the other stakeholders in the ecosystem?
Katie, call to action to your colleagues.
I think there's some benefit as well from organizations getting together and coming up with some sort of agreement and mapping in general of what the stakeholders are, because they really have changed and evolved quite a bit even over the last decade. And I think there are different organizations operating under different stakeholder assumptions as well as different stakeholders as a whole. So I think step one is just having a semblance of agreement of to who those individuals are and who those players are, as well as then how we're going to interact with them, how we're going to involve them and involving them from those initial product development, from those initial stages. And I also think it's important, as I mentioned, just help get them engaged and to help collaborate with your stakeholders, having some transparency with your data. I understand that everyone has concerns over IP and how to do that effectively without compromising your competitive edge, but being able to share that data is going to have larger stakeholder engagement, higher patient satisfaction, as well as just involve patients on their health journey.
Call to action for our internal
Yeah,
stakeholders.
my call to action is, I think it will be balanced because this whole stakeholders mapping requires a holistic solution. So we don't have a simple answer like everybody wants, a simple solution to a complex answer. No, it's a holistic, complex ecosystem, and it requires balance. Why? Because internally, we are not good at doing many things at the same time. We need focus. So when you have a holistic 360-degree solution to provide in the system, and where you people are good at only one thing is focusing on one strength, you have a problem. And from my perspective, I've been witnessing the tech industry trying to find this balance. They were saying, yeah, healthcare will come to that. We'll understand how regulation works. We'll understand all the balance. Once they got this, the risk I found, and this is what I'm trying to prevent my company to fall into, is to lose the connection with stakeholders. Because once you cut connection with the stakeholders, you don't understand, you don't have the loop back to understand your system. So you can become just a biochemical producer, and you lose your value in that system. That's my concern.
Great, thank you. So you can now bring your questions from your back brain to your front brain, and we take questions, reflections, feedback, anything. What are your thoughts on the topic at hand? First moment. Waiting.
Not everyone at the same time.
Yeah, don't rush. Anything? Oh, there's a hand way at the back.
Hi, it's Gabriella D Salvatore. I like your comment, Christopher, on the talent in the industry. But I've also been in this industry for many, many years, and I was in Pfizer, by the way, and we actually did bring in some people that didn't come from the industry, and that didn't really work either. Maybe a reflection on, is it difficult to come from another industry and go into the pharma, or a little bit more reflection on that?
Yeah, I think it's different. I came from outside the industry, and I think I've done relatively well. But I also think that I had the appropriate senior leadership in order to make that happen. I'll tell you, the greatest challenge that we see from folks that I've seen come into Pfizer from outside the industry, it's not that they lack talent, it's that we didn't effectively assess their talent and the role they would play in the organization. We thought they would come into a traditional model, perform their role, and we're going to let them be. But the second thing that we see that is a great challenge for them is the level of organizational resistance to the fact that they are a non-pharma person coming into the industry. So it's not that they're not capable, it's just that the resistance from I'm going to say, the legacy players are not as receptive to that new skill set being introduced into this model. The interesting thing now is that with everything being disrupted is that now people are, they're so concerned with their own self-preservation that they don't have as much focus to direct toward that new talent coming in, more so than trying to save themselves. But I think that under normal circumstances, the pushback and the lack of success you've seen is, sure, don't get me wrong, now these folks don't understand some of the complexities associated with biopharma as an industry, which you should complement that or pair them with folks that do and maximize the skills that they bring to the table. And we haven't done the onboarding process for this unconventional talent in pharma very well, and I think that's something we're going to have to improve. It's no longer an optional play.
It's interesting. I went from consulting to 10 years in industry and back to consulting, and organizational resistance to an outsider is, I mean, I think I still have the bruises and the scratches and the bite marks going both directions. And some of that is human, right? Sort of a resistance to a different voice, but some of that is problematic and in tension with what we say, which is we want disruptive thinking. We want innovation. Well, we can't have innovation if me growing up in pharma in Kendall Square or Central Square in Cambridge, Massachusetts, within the same 6 to 8 blocks, we all just rotate. You know, people say all the time, like, I basically just move building to building, but I keep my parking spot, you know, because it's just one company to the next. And so there is sort of a doubling down on the same kind of thinking, which does not lead to thinking differently, which I think is the definition of innovation. Or maybe solving problems differently. So it's a little bit of a tension, I think. We have just about a minute left. It looked like you were moving to say something. Haider, did you want to comment on that?
No, I mean, for me, when you bring the word innovation, so we always look at innovation through this lens, which is like maybe technology or process. We don't look at it as a relationship. So how do we innovate in our relationship, both internally and externally? And I think that there is also collateral beauty in innovating on how we talk to people, or how we change our tone, or how we basically don't speak and listen. But innovating in that sense is maybe small for some people, but it actually maybe creates a lot of impact. That was just a comment.
Last words, Katie?
I admittedly don't have too much experience on the talent side, but I think it was good coverage. I can attest, moving from healthcare into pharmaceutical consulting, that it's a bit of a challenge, and I think how you're received by your coworkers and the opportunities they give you and the way they interact with you is a big part of your success in a different industry. At least from my own personal successes, transferring a bit between industries as well.
So if I were to thread all of these call to actions together, I would say that our bumper sticker or our t-shirt might be test our assumptions and see what we learn. I don't know if you agree with that, but that's what I sort of hear in all the different sectors. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, folks.